Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Buckeye Politics. It's me, your favorite Ohioan. Today, we're going to be doing the updated 2022 Senate prediction. This is going to be a pretty interesting prediction, as it is we're pretty much a month out right now. We're finally starting to get some ideas about how these races are going to shape out. And I'm not going to lie, it's not looking as good as I first thought it was going to do for the Republican Party, but I still believe we're going to be favored. If you look at the most recent polls that have come out, we're beginning to see small surges here and there, and I do think that is going to continue into November. So let's start by filling in these safe Republican states. These are the states that are going to vote Republican pretty much no matter what you do. Those are Idaho, Utah, the Dakotas, Iowa. Chuck Grassley, the incumbent Republican senator there, he's been in the Senate since like the 1970s. He's super popular in Iowa. He's just a local family farmer guy. He's beloved there. He always wins by huge margins. He's going to win by a safe margin. The states of Kansas, Missouri, both of Oklahoma's elections, as there is a special election, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Kentucky, Indiana, Alaska, South Carolina, and Florida. Instead of Florida, Marco Rubio, the incumbent Republican senator there, he won back in 2016 by like 8 points or so. He's very well liked in the state. Florida has continued to become more of a Republican-leaning state on the presidential and lower ballot, and because of that, I do think he's going to win by just more than 10 points. We're going to start now by filling in the Democratic states. These are the states that are going to vote for the Democrats by more than 10 percentage points. These are pretty much the safe Democratic states. No matter what you do, as I said, same with the Republican states, no matter what you do, no matter how much money you spend, they're going to vote Democrat. They are Oregon, California, Hawaii, Illinois, although that could get interesting, Maryland, New York, Connecticut, and Vermont. So these remaining states, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and New Hampshire, are all the more competitive states. These are the states that will be decided between 0 and 5 and 0 and 10 percentage points. So these states will all be decided by less than 10 percentage points. Some are more competitive than others, but they're still, at least at a margin level, in my opinion, going to be a little bit more competitive. We're going to go east to west, as we usually do, meaning we are going to start in the great state of New Hampshire, the Granite State. That is a state that's going to lean to the Democratic Party. Right now, the incumbent Democrat, Maggie Hassan, is pretty popular in the state. I mean, she's not like super popular, and she is certainly vulnerable, but she's also not despised there either. And the Republican nominee, Don Bolduc, is a little bit too conservative for New Hampshire. New Hampshire is an interesting state politically. It's pretty libertarian-esque. It's like socially liberal but fiscally conservative. They like their taxes low, and they love their gay marriage. Pretty much to summarize New Hampshire's politics. And Don Bolduc and they also are very non-interventionist. New Hampshire is famous for, voting against it being interventionist in foreign policy. And Don Bolduc, the Republican nominee, has been a big supporter of getting involved in getting boots on the ground in Ukraine. So I do think that's going to hurt him. And yes, he might campaigning in economics and social and being economically right wing may help him in a state like New Hampshire. But I think Maggie Hassan's just too popular. And with Roe v. Wade being overturned, that's an issue that people don't talk about as much. New Hampshire is probably one of the states that Roe v. Wade will play an impact in, just because the voters there are relatively suburban, relatively left-leaning on social issues. They're all about their freedom or whatever, their perceived freedom. But so New Hampshire, I just don't think I think the Republicans needed to have a better nominee. I think Maggie Hassan is probably just a little bit too strong of an incumbent, and the national environment isn't exactly there. I think Don Bolduc is probably is a good guy, and I think he's running the best campaign he can. But for a state like New Hampshire, I think it's just too far out of the ballpark. I think Maggie Hassan's going to win by a lean margin. Instead of Pennsylvania, that's going to tilt to the Republican Party. And last time I had this race going to John Fetterman, the Democratic nominee. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've really looked at this race, I do think Dr. Oz is probably going to pull off a victory here. The polls have been getting much more competitive, like I've already said. And if you look at the polls that traditionally are more accurate, such as Emerson, Trafalgar, and some more local pollsters, they do show Dr. Oz surging. John Fetterman has basically gotten so much money, and he has done every trick in the book in terms of exploiting Dr. Oz being from New Jersey, or the whole puppy incident. Look that up. It's been proven false, basically. But if John Fetterman has had all the money, he's had basically control over the narrative for this race, and Dr. Oz is still surging. The Republicans are finally starting to pump a bunch of money into this race. Oz has been campaigning the whole time, and I do think that John Fetterman's going to get very hurt with his support from black voters. African American voters are a very critical part of the Democratic coalition in Pennsylvania. They make up a large population in Philadelphia, and John Fetterman did very poorly with them in the primary, and they just don't seem very energized based on polls to turn out for him. Obviously, he's still going to win the black vote by a huge margin, but I don't think that enough of them are going to turn out, and with Dr. Oz surging in the suburbs of Philadelphia, which I think he will, Oz has made great gains in Philadelphia, and the polls have also been underestimating western Pennsylvania, such as like the Pittsburgh area and the more working class counties out there. Those areas John Fetterman might make small gains in, and compared to 2020 and Trump's performance, he might win a couple Trump voters over, but the vast majority of those voters are going to support Dr. Oz, and polling usually undersamples those voters. Western Pennsylvania is a pretty Republican-leaning area now, and like I said, John Fetterman might do decently in Western Pennsilvania, but it's not good. But Oz is still going to win there relatively handily, and the polls have been really undersampling that part of the state. And Dr. Oz did like they did in the primary, and that's an area Dr. Oz is going to do well in. So the fact that Dr. Oz is already surging in Pennsylvania, it shows he's doing very well with suburbanites near New Jersey and in the Philadelphia area, and he's also probably going to have plenty of votes that he can gain in Western Pennsylvania, since those areas aren't being added into the polls, and they usually vote solidly Republican. So I think Dr. Oz is probably going to pull off a narrow victory. Looking at the state of Ohio, my great home state, that's going to be likely Republican. J.D. Vance has pretty much united the Republican base. I went to the Trump rally on September 17th. It was indeed very epic. Trump and Vance got a huge. Everyone there seemed to love Vance. The base is united around him. I mean, we were in Youngstown, Ohio. We were literally in Tim Ryan's district, and there was an entire stadium filled up with people ready to turn out and vote for J.D. Vance and the entire Republican ticket. And all Tim Ryan could do was tweet about, oh, my Ohio State game. Vance is holding a rally on the night of the Ohio State game. Well, Vance literally has an entire stadium filled up of people ready to support him, ready to get him elected. So Tim Ryan at this point, I think, is pretty much done. A couple polls have shown Tim Ryan still in the fight, but the vast majority of more accurate pollsters, whether it be Emerson or Trafalgar, do show J.D. Vance surging, and even some other polls that traditionally oversampled the Democrats by a bunch, like Baldwin Wallace. Baldwin Wallace is a university up here in Ohio. It had Joe Biden winning Ohio by like 9 points, and it only has Tim Ryan up by like 4. So that's already a good sign for Vance, because I mean, even polls that usually have the Democrats, usually way oversampled Democrats, have this race relatively competitive. And if you look at the Wikipedia page, you'll say, oh, this race might be kind of close. It's not going to be. Tim Ryan might make small gains in Mahoning County and the Youngstown area, as like I said, he is from there. Although my fears of that happening have kind of been nuanced a bit since I did go to the rally and I saw how much energy is for Vance in that part of the state. But even then, Vance is going to undo that with trends in the Cincinnati area. Vance is from that part of the state. That is where he did very well there in the primary, and he's running a perfect campaign for southwestern Ohio, really, when you think about it. And I also think Vance is going to do very well with rural voters in Appalachia, possibly even outperform Trump in some areas, maybe like near the Kentucky border. And the suburbs are probably going to vote for, they might revert a little bit to Tim Ryan, but I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue. Vance is running a campaign where he's also making crime a big priority, which is a huge issue for suburban voters. So I really, every single one of the things Tim Ryan is supposedly going to capitalize on and win, I just don't see it at this point. I think Vance probably underperforms Trump by a tad. I think he's going to win by about 7 points, but I don't think it's going to be close at all. The state of North Carolina is also going to be likely for the Republican Party. If a state is likely, that means it will go to the whichever candidate by between 5 and 10 percentage points. So, a relatively close race, but still not that close. Still a solid victory for whichever candidate this is. So Ted Budd in North Carolina, I expect him to win by about 5 points or so. Polls show this race really competitive, although Ted Budd clearly has a narrow advantage. The polls in North Carolina always underestimate Republicans. They had Joe Biden winning, they had Hillary Clinton winning, they had Barack Obama winning, and yet every single time the Republicans win in North Carolina. The same thing can be said for the Senate races, where in 2020, the Senate race had the Democrats winning by like 5 points, and then out of nowhere, the Republicans won by like 1 or 2. So the polls in North Carolina always overestimate the Democratic Party, and right now they have Ted Budd winning. So the fact that the polls are already Democratic biased, and Ted Budd is still leading in the polls, is a very good sign for me. Also, North Carolina usually takes a pretty big swing during wave years for the Republicans, so I expect Ted Budd to win probably by just a little bit more than 5 points. The state of Georgia, this is a race that I've been going back and forth on. For a while, I thought Herschel Walker was in a pretty good position. Beginning to question that a little bit. There's been some scandals that have come out about his campaign, and Raphael Warnock has gotten a bunch of funding from the Democrats. However, there is going to be a debate later this month. I think that'll probably be a good gauge on what happens. If Herschel Walker has a good showing in the debate, then I do think that, and the polls continue to show him polling pretty much even with Raphael Warnock, then I do believe he's in a pretty good spot. That said, right now the polls have this race very competitive, but I do believe Walker is narrowly going to pull this race off. I think it's going to be a lot closer than I first thought it was going to be, but I don't see a way where Raphael Warnock can win this race at this point. There's a lot of the polls clearly show Herschel Walker getting very close to leading, and they haven't even accounted for the polls in October traditionally get more accurate, and they already have Herschel Walker pretty close, and at least most excuse me. At least most polls have Herschel Walker pretty much within striking distance of Raphael Warnock. And Herschel Walker is also going to launch a huge ad blitz this month. He's gotten a lot of funding from the Republican Party, which is good to see. And Raphael Warnock is struggling to get above 50%. A good gauge for an incumbent senator or any incumbent politician is to see if they can get above 50% in polls. Raphael Warnock has struggled to do so, and it's in the and also along with that, suburban Atlanta, which is the area that propelled Joe Biden to victory in 2020. Suburban Atlanta is very white, very college educated, pretty relatively wealthy. These are people that probably voted for Mitt Romney and John McCain, but didn't like Trump's personality, so they're voting for the Democrats. Those are some of the suburban Atlanta and places similar to that are some of the most anti-Biden places in the country. They have completely turned on Biden, and I just don't think they're going to turn out for Raphael Warnock. Also, Brian Kemp is leading in the polls by like 5, 6, 7 points in the governor's race. Brian Kemp, the incumbent Republican governor, he's absolutely crushing Stacey Abrams. Well, the Senate race is pretty much even. I think Brian Kemp's probably going to carry Herschel Walker to victory. Brian Kemp, I don't see how there can be that much vote splitting in Georgia, because especially in the deep South, the more African Americans tend to vote Democrat, whites tend to vote Republican, and then the suburbs is pretty much a toss up, and whoever does very well there traditionally wins the state. But and so really, I don't see how there's going to be that much vote splitting. If Brian Kemp's going to win by like 7, 8 points, I don't see how Raphael Warnock can win by a sizable margin either. That said, like I said, Herschel Walker has clearly struggled recently. He's had a couple of scandals come out, and he's probably not in the best position compared to where he was a month or so ago. But I do believe he is going to eke out this race here. If you look at he's doing very well in funding, and the places he needs to win are all pretty anti-Biden places. So if he can just get his message out this last month, I do think he'll surge in the polls and manage to pull off a narrow victory. The state of Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is going to win by a likely margin. I have no idea how people think Mandela Barnes, the Democratic nominee, is going to win. Mandela Barnes is an anti-white race hustler who has literally became the lieutenant governor, and all he's done is rant on Twitter about how white people are bad, and how he would have been okay if his mom aborted him because he has the right to do so. Yeah, that's gonna have you do well in a socially conservative Midwestern 95% white state like Wisconsin. Yeah, good luck with that. And Ron Johnson is I wouldn't say he's a popular senator, but he is pretty well liked up in Wisconsin. And the polls usually underestimate Ron Johnson, whether it be in 2016 or 2010. They had Ron Johnson losing in basically every single poll, but he managed to pull off a 1-point win in 2010 and about a 3-point win in 2016, and that was when not a single pollster had him winning. Now most pollsters have him winning by 2, 3, 4 points, so he's probably going to outperform that by a little bit, probably win by about 6, 7 points at this point. I think Ron Johnson is a very good fit for Wisconsin. He's running a perfect campaign. His ads have been perfectly spot on in attacking Mandela Barnes, and he's also gotten a lot of funding, and Democrats are pretty much given up on this race from what I've seen. Mandela Barnes has gotten very little funding, and it's basically just going to be how much can Ron Johnson win by. The state of Colorado is going to be likely Democratic. Joe O'Dea, the Republican nominee, I thought he might have had a chance for a little bit. I heard good things about his campaign early on, but he's kind of like doing a really interesting political strategy, and that is he's trying to run to the left of the Democrat, which probably sounds good for a state like Colorado, which is, a pretty Democratic-leaning state. But when you take into account that, you have like 35 to 40% of the state that is socially conservative in the rural areas, it's probably not the best strategy to alienate those voters. I think Joe O'Dea was running a good campaign early on. He was managing to capitalize on inflation and try to win over some of those more liberal voters in the Denver area. But he has just gone too far left, in my opinion. I think he's going to lose a lot of support in rural Colorado. And the incumbent Democrat is relatively well liked, and the polls have shown Joe O'Dea begin to drop off a little bit. And so because of that, I do expect the Democrats to win the state by about 6 points or so. The state of Arizona, it's also going to be tilt Republican. Blake Masters, the Republican nominee, was recently, basically 2 months ago, no one even knew who this guy was. He was a no-name candidate. Meanwhile, Mark Kelly, the incumbent Democrat, is basically seen as this moderate national hero. I mean, this guy spent like the longest time of any human in space. He ran as this like very moderate Democrat. He won by a pretty sizable margin in Arizona, which is usually a relatively Republican-leaning state. And then the Republicans nominated Blake Masters, who everyone said was this far-right, no-name candidate that would never win. And yet the polls are beginning to show this race could become very competitive. A couple polls, including one sponsored by the Democratic Party, have Blake Masters only down by 1 point. A poll came out today by CBS News, which is usually relatively accurate. It's a slight Democratic bias, like most polls, but it is relatively accurate, especially in Arizona. They only have Blake Masters down by about 3 or so. And a lot of polls have Mark Kelly only polling at 46-47%. You would think a supposedly well-liked, moderate, national hero would be getting more than 45% of the vote and have more people on his side. I mean, this is a very well-known candidate. This is a guy who won by a pretty sizable margin back in 2020, and yet he is struggling to get over 50% of the vote. Blake Masters is beginning to gain on him. The debate for this race is actually happening tomorrow. If Blake Masters can really make his case tomorrow, which I think he will, Blake Masters, people don't talk about this, but Blake Masters is a very talented public speaker. I mean, Mark Kelly is too, but Blake Masters is also a very intellectual, very talented speaker. So I'm very interested to see how those two go against each other in the debate tomorrow. But I think if Blake Masters can have a good debate performance tomorrow, which I do believe he will, he has had great debate performances throughout the Republican primary. And so if he can just do well in the debate tomorrow, possibly get a couple more ads out before the election, which he said he's going to. He's finally getting the funding from Peter Thiel and Mitch McConnell to an extent. So hopefully Blake Masters is going to be able to launch some ad blitzes and do well in the debate and continue to capitalize on the surge that he's already seeing despite not having funding and not debating Mark Kelly yet. State of Nevada, that's going to be lean Republican. Adam Laxalt, the Republican nominee for Senate, is polling very well, surprisingly. Nevada is a state that Republicans have always come so close to winning, it feels like every time, but then they never do. But Adam Laxalt came very close to winning the governorship of Nevada back in 2018. He campaigned with Trump in 2020, and Trump made this race a lot more interesting than most people expected. However, the polls do traditionally have a slight Republican bias. Like even in 2018, a lot of polls had Adam Laxalt leading Steve Sisolak in the governor race, but then Steve Sisolak went on to win. That's because the polls there traditionally oversample white voters, as Nevada is a relatively mixed state. There's a large Hispanic population, but Blake Masters has actually done relatively well. I mean, not Blake Masters, excuse me. Adam Laxalt in Nevada has done a relatively good job with Hispanics in the state, and so even if this polls do oversample whites and Hispanics turn out a sizable margin, Adam Laxalt is already polling decently with Hispanics, so that vote probably is going to even out a little bit, and Adam Laxalt will probably still go on to win relatively handily. Also, Catherine Cortez Masto, she is not really running a campaign. She's refused to debate Adam Laxalt. From what I've seen, she's not gotten a whole lot of money from the DNC. She's barely spent any time in Nevada. While Adam Laxalt has been blitzing the state, spending a lot of money, he's campaigning his butt off, and the polls show him winning. There's not been a single poll that shows Catherine Cortez Masto winning since like August. It's been 2 months, and Adam Laxalt has led in every single poll. So you're telling me that he's in a bad position to win? Yeah, I don't think so. Lean or Adam Laxalt's going to be a great senator. The last state we have is the state of Washington. I think that's going to be likely D. Tiffany Smiley, she's a good candidate for the Republican Party. She is a good nominee. She's probably the best we could have put up. But it is a very solidly Democratic state, and Patty Murray has gotten a bunch of money from the Democrats, which tells me that this race might be a little bit more competitive than people think. If Washington was really safety and Tiffany Smiley was just a no-name candidate who had no chance of winning, the Democrats wouldn't spend millions and millions of dollars in Washington. But they are, so even if the race was competitive, which I personally believe it is kind of competitive, I think that's kind of going to undo that. And Tiffany Smiley, she's ran the best campaign she can, but I just don't see it. I think Washington is too Democratic-leaning of a state. I mean, Joe Biden won here by like more than 20 points or so. The Seattle area has grown immensely over the last couple decades. It's become a very diverse, very progressive area. So I think Tiffany Smiley is going to do a good job uniting rural Washington under her side, and also do relatively well in the suburbs. The suburbs of Seattle are not the suburbs they used to be. Seattle, believe it or not, used to be a relatively working class city. Now it's a pretty millennial, college educated area. But I do think Tiffany Smiley will do decently in that area. I think she'll do very well in rural Washington. But I just don't think the votes are there. I mean, Washington is such a blue state that I don't think there is enough Republican and independent vote that can bring down Patty Murray. Is it possible? I mean, yeah, some polls show this race very competitive. I mean, I think Trafalgar only had her down by like 2 or 3 or so. But right now, I just don't see it. I think it's going to be likely Democrat. So with that, thank you for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed. And if you did, please like and subscribe for more.